Sometimes the thing everyone laughs at is the very thing that will save you when trouble finally arrives.
In the spring of 1936, 13-year-old Caleb Bennett came to live on his grandparents' cattle farm outside Dry Creek, Kansas, carrying more grief than luggage after losing his father. Most boys his age would have been fixing fence, clearing rows, or hauling feed. Caleb did none of that. Instead, he spent his mornings marking the ground with a length of twine and planting young evergreens in careful, measured lines along the north and northwest sides of the barn. The neighbors slowed their wagons to stare. Some guessed he wanted shade. Others said he was planting timber he would not live long enough to cut. A few simply called it decoration. Caleb never corrected them. He kept digging, tamping the soil, and moving to the next spot while his brown and white farm dog, Patch, rested nearby with one ear raised. What the neighbors did not know was that Caleb had been watching the farm long before he lifted the first shovel. Each hard wind from the northwest drove snow against the same barn wall. Each cold front pushed the cattle into one cramped corner, where they pressed shoulder to shoulder for shelter. Caleb had seen frost gather inside the boards and watched his grandfather fight frozen doors after every storm. To everyone else, these were ordinary hardships, the kind farmers accepted without question. To Caleb, they were warnings. So while the town saw a lonely boy planting pretty trees, Caleb was quietly building an answer to a problem no one else had bothered to name. But the more carefully Caleb worked, the more the town decided something had to be wrong with him. By early May, word had traveled from fence lines to feed stores, and nearly everyone around Dry Creek had an opinion about the Bennett boys' trees. Walter Briggs, the rancher next door, was the first to speak to him directly. Walter had spent 30 years reading grass, cattle, and weather, and he was not cruel. He believed work should serve an obvious purpose. Leaning against the fence, he told Caleb those evergreens would need years before they cast useful shade, and even longer before they offered timber. He warned that Kansas summers could kill half the seedlings before winter tested them. Caleb listened, nodded, and returned to his shovel. Days later, Roy Haskins, the carpenter, joked at the hardware store that Caleb was growing a forest around a barn old enough to collapse before the trees matured. The comment earned laughter, and soon the project became a story repeated whenever people passed the Bennett place. Even Caleb's older cousin Thomas said he was wasting water meant for the garden and livestock. None meant to wound him, but every remark carried the same message. A 13-year-old boy could not understand the land better than men who had worked it for decades. Caleb never argued. He checked the spacing, tightened the twine, dug the next hole, and poured another bucket around the roots, while Patch watched beneath the wagon. Walter sometimes paused at the fence, convinced he was sparing Caleb from disappointment. What no one realized was that Caleb was not planting for the summer they could see. He was preparing for the winter they had forgotten how to fear. Yet the real reason behind Caleb's strange rows was hidden inside an old wooden tool chest no one in Dry Creek had opened for years. One winter evening, long before the first seedling touched Kansas soil, Samuel Bennett called his grandson into the shed and pulled out a faded county agricultural bulletin, its pages brittle and its margins dark with penciled notes. The booklet described shelter belts, carefully planned rows of trees meant to break the force of prairie winds, steer drifting snow away from buildings, protect livestock, and hold precious warmth around barns during brutal cold snaps. Samuel tapped one weathered diagram with a work-worn finger. "You cannot stop the wind," he told Caleb, "but you can make it spend its strength before it reaches what matters." Caleb never forgot the sentence. All winter he studied the bulletin beside the kitchen stove, comparing its sketches with what he had seen outside. The snow packed against the northwest wall, the cattle crowding into one corner, the barn doors freezing shut after every hard storm. By spring, he had turned those observations into a plan. He would not plant one decorative line. He marked several staggered rows, spacing the outer trees wider and the inner rows tighter, so the wind would lose force gradually instead of striking a solid wall. He also left narrow openings where drifting snow could settle safely beyond the barn, rather than piling against the doors. Samuel watched him measure the ground twice before digging once. To the neighbors, Caleb's pattern looked needlessly complicated. To Caleb, every gap, angle, and foot of distance had a purpose. He was not planting trees for beauty, shade, or timber. He was building a shield out of patience, geometry, and an old lesson nearly everyone else had forgotten. But the plan Caleb had built so carefully on paper was about to face an enemy no diagram could control. The Kansas summer. By late June, the grass around Dry Creek had turned brittle. The stock pond had dropped low, and the young evergreens began to curl at the tips. Every morning before breakfast, Caleb carried 2 dented buckets nearly a quarter-mile from the pond to the tree rows, making trip after trip beneath a white, hot sky. Patch followed until even the dog began resting in the wagon's shade. Still, several seedlings browned and died. Then, in September, a hard wind tore through the farm after midnight, ripping stakes from the ground and leaning half a row toward the barn. Caleb spent the next day resetting them, only to wake 2 mornings later and find 3 escaped cattle among the trees. Hooves had crushed the outer row, branches lay snapped in the dirt, and one strong seedling had been torn out by the roots. For the first time, Caleb stood there without reaching for his shovel. He counted what remained and wondered whether the neighbors had been right. Maybe the trees were too small. Maybe winter would arrive before they could matter. Samuel did not tell him to keep going. He only asked, "What did the damage teach you?" That question changed everything. Caleb replaced the weakest seedlings, drove heavier stakes deeper into the soil, and tied the trunks with soft cloth so the bark would not split. He spread straw mulch around the roots to hold moisture and built rough wooden snow fencing between the outer rows, giving the young trees a temporary shield until they were strong enough to stand alone. The result was not the perfect shelter belt shown in the old bulletin. It was uneven, patched, and built from whatever the farm could spare. But by the time the first cold wind swept across the pasture, Caleb had learned the lesson that mattered most. Preparation is not about getting everything right the first time. It is about refusing to let the first failure become the final result. Then the land began sending warnings no one could afford to ignore. Autumn arrived weeks too early in Dry Creek. Blackbirds gathered on fence lines and vanished south before the fields were fully harvested. The cattle grew restless before sunset, pressing against the south side of the pasture as if trying to escape something carried on the wind. One morning, Caleb found ice across the shallow trough, even though the calendar still promised mild nights. Samuel noticed it too, but said nothing until Amos Reed came riding up the lane. Amos had spent 40 years working the railroad, studying clouds, pressure, and wind, because bad weather could kill a crew miles from shelter. He stood beside the barn, watched the northwest sky. "This county is in for a winter it won't forget," he told Samuel. Caleb heard every word. From that moment, the trees became only one part of his preparation. He tightened every rope around the stakes, repaired weak sections of snow fencing, cleared the barn doors, sealed loose boards, stacked extra hay, and moved feed closer to the stalls. He filled lanterns, set blankets near the newborn calves, and placed a shovel inside the barn in case snow blocked the entrance from outside. The neighbors watched him work and shook their heads. Walter Briggs said Caleb was preparing for a storm that might never come. Roy Haskins joked that the boy would wear himself out before the first real snow. Caleb did not answer. He had learned that survival rarely depends on one brilliant idea. It comes from a dozen small decisions made before anyone else believes they matter. And then, in the second week of January, every warning Caleb had taken seriously came roaring across the prairie at once. The blizzard struck Dry Creek before dawn, driving snow sideways so hard that fence posts vanished within minutes. By sunrise, visibility had collapsed to a few yards. The temperature had fallen below zero, and the wind screamed against every barn in the county like it meant to tear the boards loose. Walter Briggs tied a rope around his waist just to reach his cattle, but a drift had packed against the main doors so tightly he could barely force them open. At Roy Haskins' place, part of a roof panel peeled away and disappeared into the white. Across several neighboring farms, livestock crowded into corners, shivering as wind pushed through cracks no one had repaired in time. At the Bennett farm, the storm still hit hard. The young evergreens bent under the force, and the rough snow fencing rattled until Caleb feared it would snap. But the outer rows broke the wind's first assault and lifted part of it above the barn. Snow gathered in long ridges beyond the trees instead of piling directly against the walls. The barn shook, but the doors remained usable. Samuel and Caleb could still reach the stalls, break ice from the troughs, spread fresh bedding, and keep the cattle moving. The hay stayed dry because the loose boards had been sealed. The feed remained close because Caleb had moved it days earlier. The lanterns were full, the blankets were ready, and the shovel was already inside when one drift partially blocked the entrance. Nothing about the night was easy. One section of fencing collapsed, 2 trees split near the base, and snow still found its way through the smallest gaps. Yet the Bennett barn had something the others did not: enough protection, enough access, and enough preparation to keep a dangerous storm from becoming a disaster. Caleb had not stopped the blizzard. He had simply forced it to spend some of its strength before it reached what mattered most. By morning, as the wind finally weakened and the first pale light returned, the purpose of every tree, every stake, and every quiet hour of work stood written across the snow. No speech could have made the lesson clearer. The storm had answered every question the town had asked, but what happened after the blizzard mattered even more than what Caleb had protected, because one quiet boy's work was about to change how an entire community understood preparation. 2 days after the wind died, Walter Briggs crossed the Bennett pasture expecting to find the same damage he had spent hours repairing on his farm. Instead, he stopped beside the outer rows of evergreens where the storm had piled snow in long ridges far from the barn doors. The trees were bent, part of the wooden fencing had collapsed, and the barn still carried the scars of the night. But the entrance opened free, the hay remained dry, and the cattle stood calm and healthy inside. Walter studied the scene for a long time before turning to Caleb. "I thought you were planting trees," he said quietly. "You were preparing for a winter the rest of us had not taken seriously." Caleb did not smile, boast, or remind him of every joke. He simply nodded towards Samuel and the faded county bulletin resting on the workbench. "Grandpa showed me where to look," he said. "I just kept working." The following spring, Walter planted a shelter belt along the north side of his barn. Roy Haskins spent 3 weekends helping a struggling family build protective fencing and refused every dollar they offered. Within a few years, rows of evergreens appeared across Dry Creek. Decades later, Caleb's original trees had grown tall enough to become a landmark for travelers on the Kansas prairie. His greatest achievement was not saving one barn. It was restoring forgotten practical wisdom and passing it forward. Have you ever kept working on something others dismissed, only to see its value revealed later? Share your story below. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to Solace Farm Stories for rural stories about patience, courage, family, and the quiet choices that matter most when the storm finally comes.